A small backyard at the edge of an aging farmstead. Spring light, low and watery. In the back corner, a 30-year-old asparagus bed throws thumb-thick spears through a blanket of last year's papery leaves. Quiet, generous, untouched since the November mulch. Most people, 15 feet away, are on their knees again, tilling the same row of tomato dirt they have tilled for 14 straight springs. But the old farmers who watched the orchards outlive the men who planted them have known something for 2 centuries that changes everything. In almost every case, the work in a garden is not the harvest. It is simply the planting, done over and over, every spring, against the grain of how a plant wants to live. There are crops that ask for one planting and feed a household for a lifetime, set once, returning year after year, decade after decade, with no spring labour and no seed catalogue. 12 of them, to be exact. 12 perennial food plants that the agricultural extension stations have studied for soil building potential, that the Pennsylvania Dutch and Old Order Amish have grown in dooryard plots for 200 years, and that the seed industry quietly hopes the homesteader never plants. There is no shelf space in an asparagus crown. This is the story of those 12, what each one does, why each one outlives the season that planted it, and the mistake nearly every homesteader makes when first walking past the seed catalogue into the perennial bed. First, asparagus. What kind of plant feeds a household for 30 springs from a single planting? A single crown, set in good ground, will throw spears for 25 to 30 years. Each spear carries glutathione, the body's master antioxidant, the molecule the liver uses to neutralize what the modern diet brings in. The concentration in fresh-cut asparagus is among the highest measured in any common vegetable, and it is paired with folate, asparagusic acid, and a slow prebiotic fiber called inulin. Glutathione binds free radicals, the small chemical agitators of oxidation, stress, and the slow burn in an aging joint, and walks them out of the body. A spear cut at sunrise, eaten by sundown, delivers more of it fresh than any pill on a pharmacy shelf. The mistake nearly every gardener makes is planting the crowns shallow, harvesting the first year, and tucking the row into ground meant to be tilled. Asparagus crowns must go down 8 to 10 inches, must be left untouched the first 2 springs while the root thickens, and must live in a permanent bed, a bed that mercifully never asks the gardener to bend low or kneel. That depth builds a fist-sized underground engine that pushes spears the diameter of a man's thumb each spring, the way a fruit tree pushes blossoms. The ground does the work. The gardener stands and cuts. To plant, dig a trench 8 inches deep, set crowns 18 inches apart, drape the roots like an octopus, cover with 2 inches of compost, refill the trench across the first growing season, mulch heavy in fall. By the 3rd spring, pencil-thick spears push through the mulch, then thumb-thick by the 5th day, papery purple tips standing 4 inches above the soil before sunrise. 6 to 8 weeks of spears every spring for 25 years. Cut clean at the soil line with a paring knife. No bending, no kneeling, no replanting. Every April for 3 decades. A basket of spears in the kitchen, snapped raw at the woody end, eaten with butter and salt. The grocery bunch. 4 spears bound with a rubber band, $4 at the produce counter, never enters the house again. The plant of the homeowner who set the crown in 1998 and who is still cutting spears in 2026. Here is what the seed industry would prefer no one think about. A single asparagus crown costs $3 at a feed store. 20 crowns will feed a family of 4 for 3 decades. There is no annual seed packet. There is no spring tilling. There is no chemical fertilizer rebought every May. No industrial catalogue leads with asparagus because there is no return business in a plant that does not need rebuying. But the next perennial does not need 8 inches of trenching. It needs only a corner of the yard the family does not walk through, and the patience to wait until the stalks come up red as a brake light. Second, rhubarb. A plant Marco Polo carried out of China along the Silk Roads in 1271. A plant Benjamin Franklin imported into Pennsylvania in 1772. A plant that, set into a quiet corner, will produce ruby stalks every spring for 15 to 20 years without a second planting. The kitchen's word for it is dependable. The herbalist's word for it is steadying. Rhubarb stalks carry anthraquinones, the slow, gentle compounds traditional herbalists used to steady the digestive motility that thickens with age. They carry vitamin K and a faint dose of malic acid. The leaves, however, carry oxalic acid in toxic concentration. The stalks alone are food, the leaves alone are compost. The mistake nearly every new gardener makes is planting rhubarb in full hot sun, in dry soil, in a small pot. Rhubarb wants cool ground, generous compost, partial shade in the southern states, and a permanent corner the gardener does not till. Plant it once, mulch it heavy, leave it alone. A single rhubarb crown can feed 3 families. The stalks push out red as a brake light by mid-April, thicken to 1.5 inches by May, and continue producing through the first hard frost. The anthraquinones work in the lower digestive tract. They steady the slow rhythm of an aging gut without the harsh purge of a pharmacy stimulant. A small bowl of stewed rhubarb at supper is, in the old kitchens of New England, the gentle remedy for what the doctor cannot bring himself to prescribe. To plant. Divide a mature crown in early spring, set the bud 1 inch below the soil, water deep once, mulch with composted manure. Skip the first year's harvest. By the second spring, a stalk a week. By the third spring, a basket. The mother who pulls 4 pounds of stalks for a pie in May, and 4 more pounds for a chutney in August, from a crown her own mother set in 1989. An annual feeds you for a year. A rhubarb crown feeds your grandchildren. But the next perennial does not feed gently. It scorches sharply the moment the cells are broken, and that fire is not a flaw. That fire is the medicine. Third, horseradish. Whole, the root sits silent in the earth, brittle, cool, without smell. Pull it from the ground, scrub the dirt from its papery skin, and a person could mistake it for a parsnip. There is nothing in the whole intact root that announces what it is. But the moment the cells are broken, a knife cut, a greater stroke, a chew of the raw flesh, the chemistry wakes. Horseradish carries sinegrin, a stable storage molecule that does nothing on its own. Beside it sits an enzyme called myrosinase. When the cell wall breaks, the two collide. Sinegrin and myrosinase make allyl isothiocyanate, the sharp, eye-watering, sinus-clearing fire that eclectic medicine, between 1830 and 1939, called one of the most reliable circulatory stimulants in the materia medica. The 1898 King's American Dispensatory listed freshly grated horseradish for sluggish circulation, sinus congestion, and the cold extremities of an aging body. The fire works in the upper respiratory tract first, clearing the small passages of the sinuses within 30 seconds, and then drives downward into the bloodstream, steadying circulation in the hands and feet. The mistake nearly every cook makes is buying the pre-grated jar. By the time it reaches the shelf, the allyl isothiocyanate has scorched off into the air. The medicine in horseradish lives only in the freshly grated root. The fire is not in the root. The fire is in the cut. To plant. A single root cutting in spring, buried sideways, 6 inches deep. Horseradish will spread aggressively, and this is its one warning. Plant it inside a sunken plastic tub or a galvanized stock tank, lid removed, sides intact. The tub holds the root. The gardener never digs the whole bed. By the second autumn, a basket of finger-thick roots, lifted with a fork, scrubbed in a bucket. One root grated fresh into vinegar fills a pint jar. That jar holds in the refrigerator for 6 months. The grandmother who set one root in 1975 and who has not bought horseradish since. But the next perennial covers a problem horseradish cannot. Most homesteaders are missing 4 crops at once: a starch, a fibre, a sweetener, and a feed for the gut microbiome. The next plant covers all four, and it carries a folk reputation that has scared off 3 generations of gardeners for the wrong reason. Fourth, Jerusalem artichoke, the tuber that refuses extinction. A native sunflower that throws 10-foot stalks of yellow blossom by August, and that hides, beneath the ground, a knotted cluster of pale tubers, 10 to 15 pounds per plant in good soil. It is not from Jerusalem. It is not an artichoke. It is a North American sunflower, the indigenous tribes of the eastern woodlands cultivated long before the first European seed catalogue was printed. The tuber carries inulin, not the body tissue molecule, but a slow, complex prebiotic fibre the human small intestine cannot break down. That fibre travels intact into the large intestine, where it becomes the preferred fuel of bifidobacteria and lactobacilli, the steady, beneficial bacteria that build a working gut microbiome. Now here is a point where much of the homesteading advice is simply wrong, and it is worth pausing on. For 3 generations, this plant has carried a folk nickname, the fartichoke, because raw or undercooked, it produces severe bloating and gas in a sensitive digestive system. The standard advice has been to plant it for chickens, plant it for survival calories, plant it as an emergency crop, eat it sparingly, apologise to dinner guests. That advice is wrong. The bloating is not the tuber's failure. It is a preparation failure. A bloated belly after Jerusalem artichoke can be one of 3 things, and only one of them is the tuber's fault. First, a digestive system that has never been exposed to inulin in any quantity, and that needs a slow build-up across 2 weeks. Second, a true FODMAP sensitivity, in which case the tuber is genuinely off the menu. Third, and this is the case for nearly every healthy adult who tried sunchokes once and gave up, the tuber was eaten raw or under-roasted. The cure is heat, slow and low. Slow roast Jerusalem artichoke at 325 degrees for 90 minutes, sliced into half-inch rounds, tossed with olive oil and sea salt, spread 1 layer deep on a sheet pan. The dry heat caramelizes the long inulin chains into shorter, sweeter, easier to digest fructo-oligosaccharides. The result tastes like a cross between a roasted parsnip and a sweet potato. The bloating disappears. The prebiotic feeding of the gut continues. To plant, bury 4 tubers, eye up, 4 inches deep, in a corner the gardener has decided to give up forever. Jerusalem artichoke will spread aggressively. It will return from a single fragment of tuber left in the ground. Plant it in a place the family does not walk through, and accept it as a permanent neighbour. The harvest comes after the first hard frost. The cold converts more of the inulin to sugar, and the flavour deepens. Lift the tubers with a garden fork. Store them in the ground under heavy mulch all winter. Dig as needed. A patch the size of a kitchen table will produce 120 pounds of tubers in its 3rd year, every year, without replanting, without fertiliser, without attention. The plants the chicken farmer ignores is the plants the gut microbiologist would build a clinic around. The grandfather who planted 6 tubers in 1982 still digs a basket every November. There is no profit in a tuber that grows itself. But the next perennial is the most universal allium on earth, and most homesteaders plant the wrong kind of it every fall, the kind that asks to be replanted every year. The right kind asks once and feeds for a generation. Fifth, garlic, the perennial varieties. Most gardeners plant garlic the way the seed catalogue tells them. They buy a sack of cloves every October. They break the bulb apart, push each clove into the soil, mulch heavy, and harvest in July. Then they buy another sack the next October. There is another way, a way the old Orla Amish have used for 2 centuries. True perennial garlic, the rocambole types, the Korean mountain garlic, and a small flowered cousin called crow garlic, sets seed bulbils in the air on a curling scape and small offset bulbs in the ground. Left in place, the planting multiplies itself. A patch set with 20 cloves becomes a patch of 100 bulbs in 3 years, and a patch of 300 in 5. Garlic carries alliin, a stable storage compound that, when the clove is crushed, an enzyme called alliinase converts into allicin. Allicin is the sharp, sulfurous compound traditional herbalists used to steady cardiovascular flow and to slow the bacterial load in the gut. It works fastest in the first 10 minutes after the clove is crushed. The mistake is dicing garlic, then waiting 40 minutes to add it to a hot pan. The heat kills the enzyme before the allicin has formed. Crush the clove, wait 10 minutes, then cook. To establish a perennial bed, plant a row of true seed garlic cloves in October. Mulch heavy. Leave half the bed unharvested every year. The unharvested cloves divide underground and return larger the next year. By year 3, the bed feeds itself. The kitchen that has not bought a sack of garlic since 2019. But the next allium does something more remarkable. It walks itself across the bed. It plants itself. It needs no clove, no seed, no October trip to the feed store. 6th, walking onions, the Egyptian onion. A perennial allium that throws a flowering stalk in early summer, and at the top of that stalk forms a cluster of small bulbils, topsets, the old farmers called them. The stalk grows tall, the topsets thicken. By August, the stalk falls over of its own weight. The topsets touch the ground, and they root themselves. The plant has walked. 3 feet, sometimes 4, from where it stood the spring before. Walking onions carry the same organosulfur compounds as the common onion, the sulfur compounds that steady cardiovascular function, and that traditional kitchens used in winter broths to slow the seasonal cold. But unlike the common onion, the walking onion never asks for a fall planting. The mistake nearly every gardener makes is treating the walking onion like a regular onion, pulling the whole plant in summer and starting over with sets every spring. The walking onion is a permanent bed. The leaves are cut for chives all spring. The bulbs are dug as needed in late summer. The top sets are harvested for pickling or left to plant the next year's row. To plant, set 6 top sets in a sunny corner in spring, 2 inches deep, 6 inches apart. By the next August, the row has walked. By the 3rd year, the bed has tripled in size. The gardener who has not bought a packet of onion sets since 2002. But the next perennial is older than the walking onion. It is older than the asparagus crown. It fed the kitchens of medieval Europe before the Spanish carried the potato across the Atlantic. 7th, sorrel. A low, broad-leaved perennial with the lemon-tart bite of fresh apple cider. The kitchen herb of every medieval European pottage. A plant that returns every spring from a single planting for 10 to 15 years. Sorrel leaves carry vitamin C in concentration high enough that British sailors used the cousin plant, scurvy grass, to break the long winter scurvy of the North Atlantic crossing. They carry malic acid, which gives the lemon bite, and oxalic acid, which is the one warning. Eaten in moderation, a handful in a soup, a few leaves in a salad, sorrel is a slow, gentle source of spring vitamin C. Eaten in heavy quantity, the oxalic acid binds calcium and stresses the kidneys. The mistake nearly every gardener makes is letting sorrel bolt to seed in early summer. Once it bolts, the leaves turn bitter and brittle. Cut the seed stalks the moment they appear. The plant will hold its leaf production through the entire growing season. To plant, a single nursery start in spring, set into well-drained soil, partial shade in the southern states. Divide the clump every 4 years to keep the leaves tender. The cook who pulls a handful for a French sorrel soup in May and another for a salad in October from a plant set in 2014. But the next perennial does not need division. It does not need cutting back. It sits in a corner of the herb bed and asks only to be ignored. 8th, chives. The purple-headed sentinel of every dooryard kitchen garden in North America, a perennial allium that comes up the 2nd week of April, throws a lavender pom-pom flower in May, and produces tender, hollow leaves all the way through October. Chives carry kaempferol and quercetin, 2 flavonoid compounds traditional kitchens leaned on for cardiovascular steadiness. They carry the same organosulfur compounds as the walking onion in a milder, more digestible form. Now here is the chive's quiet gift to the aging gardener. The harvest requires no bending, no kneeling, no digging. A pair of kitchen scissors, 3 inches above the soil, a clean cut. The plant returns within 5 days, the entire growing season. This is the perennial of the homesteader, managing a stiff back, a sore knee, a careful stewardship of energy. Chives in a raised bed at waist height, even a window box on a porch rail, produce more usable green per square foot than nearly any other edible plant. The mistake is letting the lavender flower heads go to seed. The seed scatters and the bed crowds itself. Cut the flowers off and use them in vinegar. The petals turn the vinegar a clean rose pink, and the bottle keeps for a year. To plant, a single nursery clump in spring, set 6 inches deep in compost-rich soil. Divide every 3 years. Each division becomes a new clump. The retiree who scissor cuts a small handful into the morning eggs from April through October, from a clump set in 2011. But the next perennial is 6 feet tall. It is the celery of the medieval garden, and it carries a scientific anchor that runs back to the court of Charlemagne. 9th, lovage. A 6-foot perennial with the taste of celery concentrated tenfold. A plant Charlemagne ordered planted in every monastery garden of his empire in the year 812. Written into the Capitulare de Villis, the imperial inventory of plants every working homestead was required to grow. Lovage carries ligustulide and apiol, 2 volatile compounds traditional herbalists use to steady fluid balance and to slow the joint stiffness of gout. The leaves carry the celery flavour in concentrations so high that 2 leaves season a pot of soup the size of a Sunday dinner. The mistake nearly every gardener makes is planting lovage in a small herb bed. Lovage is a tree among herbs, 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and it returns from the same crown for 15 to 20 years. Plant it at the back of the perennial bed, against a north fence, where its shade will not crowd the smaller herbs. The harvest is ergonomic. The leaves are picked at chest height. The hollow stalks are cut for soup. There is no bending, no kneeling, no digging until the plant is divided after a decade. A single lovage plant produces enough leaf to season every soup, stew and broth a household will make in a year, and enough to dry for the winter pantry besides. To plant, 1 nursery start in spring, set in deep compost-rich soil, full sun, watered through the first summer. By the 2nd year, a 4-foot plant. By the 3rd, a 6-foot column of celery flavour. The widow who has not bought a stalk of celery since 2007, who pulls leaves from a plant her late husband set in 2003. But the next perennial is so old it has been dropped from the modern seed catalogue entirely. It fed medieval England. It was displaced by a faster-growing competitor, and the homesteader who plants it now is reviving a crop the commercial spinach industry quietly buried. 10th, Good King Henry. A medieval English perennial with the leaves of spinach and the spring shoots of asparagus. The folk name in Lincolnshire was Lincolnshire spinach. In other counties, Mercury goosefoot, or simply Markery, a plant that fed the cottage gardens of England for 800 years, until the commercial spinach trade displaced it in the late 1800s. Good King Henry carries saponins, beta-carotene, and a steady dose of iron, the spring tonic of the medieval English winter, when no fresh greens had been available since November. The mistake nearly every modern gardener makes is comparing it to spinach. Spinach is a fast annual. Good King Henry is a slow perennial. It comes back from the same crown for 10 to 15 years and produces from April through September, where spinach bolts to seed in 3 weeks of warm weather. The young spring shoots are cut like asparagus and steamed with butter. The summer leaves are cooked like spinach. The saponins require gentle blanching to break down, after which the green is tender, faintly bitter, and reliable. To plant, nursery starts in spring, set 12 inches apart in deep compost-rich soil, partial shade. Skip the first year's harvest. By the 2nd spring, a generous cut of shoots. By the 3rd, a permanent green. The cook who has not bought a bag of grocery spinach since 2012 from a small bed set behind the kitchen door. But the next perennial is older still. It grew wild on the chalk cliffs of England before the Romans came. The Victorians forced it under clay pots for the king's table. And the homesteader who plants it now grows a vegetable the supermarket has never carried. 11th. Sea kale, a coastal European perennial with broad blue-green leaves and a thick asparagus-like spring shoot. Wild on the chalk cliffs of southern England before the Roman invasion, forced under clay pots in Victorian gardens to produce blanched white shoots for the king's table, a delicacy the upper class paid more for than for asparagus. Sea kale carries the glucosinolates of the cruciferous family, the same compound class found in broccoli and kale, the precursors to sulforaphane, the slow-acting compound nutritionists associate with cellular protection. The harvest requires the Victorian trick. In early spring, before the shoots emerge, set a clay pot or a 5-gallon bucket with the bottom cut out over the crown. The shoots push up in darkness. They emerge tender, white, mild, and free of the bitterness of unblanched leaves. Lift the pot. Cut the shoots at 3 inches. Replace the pot. The plant produces a second flush. The mistake is harvesting too aggressively the first year. A sea kale crown needs 3 full seasons before the first cut. After that, 10 to 15 years of spring shoots from the same root. To plant. Nursery crowns set in deep, sandy, well-drained soil. Sea kale will not tolerate wet feet. In full sun. Mulch heavy with seaweed if available, with composted manure if not. The Victorian forcing pot, recovered from an English junk shop, set every March over the same crown for 20 straight years. The cook who eats blanched sea kale in April, when no other green is yet alive in the garden. But the next perennial is older than the Victorian gardener, older than the medieval monastery gardener, older than the cottage garden gardener of any English county. It was already ancient when Pliny the Elder wrote about it in the year 77. 12th. Globe artichoke, the silver-leaved giant of Roman peasant gardens. A thistle the size of a dinner plate, with an edible flower bud the household harvested before the bloom opened. A plant the Greek gardeners of Carthage grew for 400 years before the Romans took the cuttings to Italy. A plant Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History of the year 77, called the cardus, the cultivated thistle, and described as the most prized vegetable in the gardens of southern Italy. Catherine de' Medici carried the cuttings to France in 1533, and the French court took up the artichoke as the vegetable of nobility. Spanish missionaries carried it to California in the early 1800s. Italian cottage gardeners have grown it, from the same divisions, for 30 generations. Globe artichoke carries cynarin, a slow, steady compound traditional herbalists use to thicken the production of bile in the liver, to redirect the digestion of fat, and to steady the slow-burning fatigue of a sluggish liver. It carries silymarin, the compound the milk thistle is named for. It carries inulin, the same prebiotic fibre that feeds the gut microbiome. The Italian peasants of Tuscany call the practice cura di carciofo, the cure of the artichoke, and they eat the bud, the leaves boiled in water, and the steaming water itself, every spring for 2 weeks, as a quiet annual cleansing of the liver. The mistake nearly every American gardener makes is treating globe artichoke as an annual. In USDA zones 7 and warmer, the plant is a true perennial. A single division, set in deep, compost-rich soil, will produce buds every spring for 10 to 12 years. In colder zones, the crowns can be lifted in November and overwintered in a cold cellar. The harvest is ergonomic. The buds form on 3-foot stalks, cut at chest height with a kitchen knife. No bending, no kneeling, no digging. The buds are steamed whole, the leaves pulled one at a time at the table, the heart eaten last with butter and sea salt. To plant. A single nursery division in spring, set in a permanent bed with 3 feet of clearance on every side. Mulch heavy through the first winter. By the second spring, the first basket of buds. By the third, a working crop. What outlasted Rome can outlast a season. the Italian grandmother who divides the same crown every 6 years from a plant her own grandmother set in Calabria in 1948 and a daughter carried in a clay pot to Pennsylvania in 1972. The ground that fed Pliny the Elder still feeds the homesteader who plants this thistle. Asparagus, rhubarb, horseradish, Jerusalem artichoke, garlic, walking onions, sorrel, chives, lovage, good King Henry, sea kale, globe artichoke, each one set once, each one returning every spring, each one carrying a compound the body has used, gently, for centuries. Year after year, decade after decade, from a single planting. Plant once, and the work belongs to the plant. This is the garden that needs no annual seed catalogue, no spring tilling, no fertilizer rebought every May, no replanting after the first hard frost. Picture the back corner of the yard, every April for the next 20 years. The asparagus pushing through the mulch, the rhubarb red as a brake light, the chives in lavender bloom, the walking onions tipped over and rooting themselves into the next row. The garden does the work. The gardener stands and cuts. A small backyard at the edge of an aging farmstead. Spring light, low and watery. A 30-year-old asparagus bed throws thumb-thick spears through a blanket of last year's papery leaves. Quiet, generous, untouched. Which of these 12 is already in the back corner of the garden, and which one is the next planting? Drop the name in the comments. The answer says everything about the kind of homestead this is. Send this to the neighbour still tilling the same row every spring, the one who has not yet noticed that the work is the seed catalogue. This is the garden the grandmother planted. This is the garden the grandchild will harvest. The crops are old. The soil is older. The work was done once, by someone who knew.